Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Dr. Ron Friedman is here with us. Brand new book out today, Decoding Greatness. Ron, nice to meet you. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So you've written other books before, but this one is fascinating on a number of different levels. And for somebody like you, who's a social psychologist, what was most fascinating about jumping into this one?
Well, so my first book, The Best Place to Work, looked at all of the signs of how we can create great workplaces. But there was something missing in that book, and that is even within the best workplaces, there's a range of performance levels. Some people are top performers, others are not. In Decoding Greatness, I looked at what are the top performers in the world doing differently, and how can we all apply their strategies to develop better workplace habits and be more effective at our jobs.
One of the things I know you looked at is hidden patterns or hidden trends. What was it like looking into some of those things?
So this is fascinating. So the stories we've been told about success, basically there are two big stories. The first story is that greatness comes from talent. This is the idea we're all born with certain inner strengths. And the key to finding your greatness is finding a field that allows your inner strengths to shine. The second story is that greatness comes from talent. This is the idea if you just practice long enough, eventually you'll be great. But there's a third story. And that third story is the focus of Decoding Greatness. And it is reverse engineering, which simply means finding great examples and then working backward to figure out how they were created and how you can apply those insights to producing better work. And so in this book, I look at the hidden patterns inside TED Talks, inside popular stories, inside popular songs. And what you find is that this is a more analytical approach to studying from great examples. And by doing that, you can detect what it is that makes them powerful. And I'll give you an example.
Sure.
One of my favorite stories in this book is Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, the famous writer, he would reverse engineer popular stories. And the way he did it was he would turn stories into a graph. And here's how he did it. So he would plot the protagonist's fortunes on a graph. So in other words, how are things going for the protagonist? Are the things going well? Are things going poorly? And he did it over time from the beginning of the story to the end. And what he found when he did this is that so many of the stories that we have fallen in love with over the years are basically the same story told with different characters. So a great example is Cinderella versus Annie. Both of them follow the exact same pattern. In the beginning, things are going poorly for the character. They get rescued. Then all hell breaks loose, back to square one. And then finally, they live happily ever after. It's the same story. We don't even realize it because we've fallen in love with it.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is. And your book speaks to that, right? You look at politics, you look at tech, you look at sports, right? Where were some of the surprises in your research? Because some of this stuff seems a little bit obvious on the surface, but there's much more to it. So what were some surprises here?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that this is a far better approach to creating original work than just staring at a blank screen. So a lot of us, we want to write a book, we want to write a movie, we have no idea where to begin. But this is why we need these analytical tools to look at some of the stories and how they were created. And so one example of something I wasn't expecting is that when you analyze the most popular TED Talk of all time and you figure out, okay, what is it that makes this different from other TED Talks? What you discover is that it has almost no facts. So if I was to write a TED Talk right now, I would imagine I'd have to throw a lot of persuasive facts at people. But in fact, the thing that makes a TED Talk popular is the anecdotes. So if I can give you a story that's memorable and moving and emotional, you're more likely to remember that and then share my TED Talk. And so that's just an example of one of the ways in which you can use these analytical tools in Decoding Greatness to figure out what it is that makes something work and how you can apply it to yourself. Another great example is that you find that some of the most novel and memorable creations are simply new combinations of existing elements that work somewhere else. And so an example of this is the story of Barack Obama. So in the book, I talk about how when he first entered politics, he was a little bit of a disaster. It's hard for us to imagine. And the problem was that he was a terrible speaker. He got trounced his first race for Congress by a margin of more than 2-1. In other words, for every 2 people who voted for his opponent, 1 person voted for Barack Obama. So he's for a while, he's thinking about leaving politics. And the reason, by the way, he was a terrible speaker is because he was a law school professor. And as a law school professor, he was used to lecturing people. Voters don't appreciate being lectured to, and they let Obama know at the ballot box. So he thinks about retiring politics until he notices what pastors are doing in churches. And he sees that they're using repetition, they're using storytelling, they're modulating their tone, they're slowing down at certain places. And he starts applying that to the way he delivers speeches. The rest is history. And it's what I love about that story is that it illustrates that Obama didn't go and find his talent. He didn't go to practice for 10,000 hours. What he did was he found what was working in a different field and he imported it into his own.
Well, you mentioned 10,000 hours, and I know you talk about Malcolm Gladwell in here. What was it like analyzing him in terms of everything we're talking about here?
So Gladwell's a fascinating story because when he first started out, what he was trying to do was learn from other writers. And much the same way that I described in Decoding Greatness, the best way to learn is figure out somebody who's the best at your field and then reverse engineer what they're doing. So for him, it was William F. Buckley. So he would love William F. Buckley and he would reverse engineer his writing. And he just kind of identified what that model was and applied it to his own work. And he admits at the beginning, it was insanely derivative. It just felt like it wasn't particularly good. But over time, he was able to combine that with other elements of different writers and eventually came upon his own technique. And obviously, he's considered one of the best writers in the field. And what his journey tells us is that you don't start by staring at a blank screen. You have to have an analytical approach to figure out what the models in your field are doing so you can learn from them.
And that's a great example too, is that somebody has done it one way and you're just going to remix it and do it a little bit differently, right? Another example is Serena Williams, and we look at her and Venus and their father, and they set the blueprint, but they were also looking at other folks. So what did you learn about her story?
Well, it's a combination of your innate strengths and then what works in your field. So it's really critical to remember that you can't just replicate somebody else's formula because chances are you're going to fall flat. And the reason for that is their particular strengths may not apply to you, but more importantly, particularly in creative fields, audience expectations evolve. And so I talk about the book Twilight. As you might recall, it was this very popular book about 10 years ago, young adult book combined with vampires. And so when that book came out, 1 million copycats broke out. Everyone had a book about teenagers in love with vampires, and they all fell flat. And it's not because they were all terrible books. It was because audience expectations have shifted. We were now expecting that. So what was the next evolution? The thing that did succeed is vampires and Abraham Lincoln. That broke out, right? So it was all about that novel twist. And I'm now looking at Lin-Manuel Miranda and how In the Heights, that movie just came out, doing very well. It's a great movie. And what you realize when you watch it is like, wait a second, all the elements for Hamilton were there, but this wasn't the breakout success that Hamilton was. What did it take? It took American history on top of Lin-Manuel Miranda's formula that made it a breakthrough success.
It's crazy because you watch In the Heights and you're like, this sounds just like Hamilton, but In the Heights comes out first. You never would have known it without Hamilton. It's just crazy how that works.
100%. And even In the Heights is just a combination of the Broadway formula with rap and salsa. And so you see how you see the pattern here, which is that take something that works, add your unique twist. And this book talks about how you can do that in your field.
So what is the biggest thing that all this says about our society? Does it say that people have just kind of figured it out and put their own spin on it? Or does it kind of say that we are endlessly fascinated with how to be great and then how to make ourselves great? What do you think?
I think what it tells us is that there's an easier path to success. And I think that so many of us have been taught that copying is wrong, that we're afraid to study the best in our field to understand them a little bit better. And that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because what research shows us is that, in fact, if you take some time to study someone in your field carefully, you're actually going to become more creative, not less. And it's because just by studying their choices more carefully, that opens you up to more opportunities in your own work. And it's not by just replicating their work. It just opens your eyes to a different way of thinking. And so it's a tool that is criminally underutilized. And I think that we've gone so far to the side where the pendulum has shifted so far to where we're so afraid of plagiarism and copying and being called unoriginal that we're neglecting a really important opportunity to learn from the best.
There's a lot to learn from those before us and those right in front of us as well. So
Exactly
Dr.
right.
Ron, really nice to meet you, man. Congrats on the book, and we'll talk to you down the road, all right?
Thank you.